I am a retired Unitarian Universalist minister with an emphasis on Universalist, and you will see that comes out in this evening. And Bibi and Terry will be reading People. In other words, I thought, I don't want to have to do all of this and these long quotes, and won't it be more exciting if we actually have people acting the people? So that's how they're doing it. Now, and if you can't hear us, raise your hand and I'll speak into the mic more. The first permanent settlement in Annisquam was established around 1656. Too few to have a church of their own, those first residents attended First Parish Gloucester, which had been founded a few years earlier in 1642. Annisquam flourished, however, and by the early 1700s was home to 60% of the wealthiest portion of Gloucester residents. The reason for the wealth was that the harbor here was busier than in Gloucester proper because of Lobster Cove's greater safety from piracy. Boats were built here, timber was cut and floated up the coast for sale, fish was exported. Sadly, much of this was dried fish that went to the southern states and the West Indies as food for slaves. Lobster Cove was a bustling port, its river crowded with working boats, and the banks were lined with fish houses and shipyards, flake yards, that's where they dry the fish, chandleries, that's where they sell the candles, cooperages, and blacksmith shops. As many as 1,500 men from all over Cape Ann came here to work in the spring. With the increase in population, Annisquam folk tired of the long distance they had to travel on Sundays, so they petitioned First Parish to allow them to form their own church. It took 2 years, but in 1728 permission was granted and Third Parish in Annisquam was established. Their first act as a congregation was to have a quarrel over where to build the church. In Lobster Cove, the safest part of the harbor, or upstream, here probably, where there are more houses and a tavern, but greater vulnerability to attack. The group wanting the Lobster Cove site paid for and had the wood delivered there, only to find in the morning that the opposing group had floated the wood upstream in the night. For several nights, the future church bobbed up and down the river until finally the Lobster Covers won. The church meeting house was square with 3 aisles, one for those entering from the cove, one aisle to the desk or the pulpit, and one which led to the upper gallery, reserved for the choir on one side and slaves and paupers on the other. At that time, there were 19 slaves in Annisquam. The minister must have had some guilty feelings about slavery, for he listed them not as slaves but as servants in the parish record. After 1780, when Massachusetts abolished slavery, I could find no records of people of color listed. The brief time of affluence, though, had been waning, and by 1730, according to Gloucester records, Annisquam was reported as having become a pocket of poverty. I like that phrase, actually. This accounts for the provision of a space for those paupers who were too poor to purchase a pew. The better off parishioners purchased pews from the 8 men who had paid for and built the meeting house. These men were also signers of the lost original church covenant. It is described as having no theology and no creed. One commentator wrote that this was not surprising, since the people of Annisquam were not unduly religious. Certainly, a Christian church which countenances slavery and segregates its poorer members is to our modern consciences downright unchristian. However, the Puritan congregations of the time ascribed to the Calvinist theology of predestination, in which God chose the elect at their birth, and only the elect could be saved for eternity, and you could do nothing to earn your salvation. It would be impossible for a slave or a pauper to be one of the elect. since if God rewarded you spiritually, he would also reward you financially and materially. So the voting membership of the church was limited to the more elite population of the parish, but the entire village could attend the services. The parish council was responsible also for secular matters as well as spiritual. For instance, petitioning Gloucester authorities to provide Annisquam with a schoolmaster, discerning what constituted parish membership and what constituted church membership became a chronic issue throughout the years for the church. The first minister, a recent Harvard graduate, the Reverend Benjamin Bradstreet, was ordained in the new meeting house in September 1728. In his charge to the minister, the Reverend John Tufts of West Newbury counseled Reverend Bradstreet.
Since it is at your request that I stand in the desk at this time, you will surely suffer me now to be your monitor. Do not pinch them with scanty sermons, for with what measure you meet, it shall be measured to you again. And then take heed unto yourself also, that your conversation in all things be as becomes the gospel. The better Christian you are, the more useful and successor minister you are likely to be.
That's good advice for ministers at any time. And Reverend Bradstreet lived it, as is evidenced by the fact that he served here for 34 years until his death. His tenure was not without some incident, however. Somehow he provoked the ire of one parishioner, Benjamin Wheeler, who spoke against him with such malice that the Reverend Bradstreet was about to sue him for defamation of character when a lawyer stepped in and elicited an apology from Mr. Wheeler. Bradstreet was also criticized by some of his fellow North Shore ministers, but not his congregation, for his response to the Great Awakening. This was a religious movement which swept through the New England churches in the 1740s, bringing a more emotional and personal form of religious expression and theology called the New Light. Bradstreet first experienced this phenomenon when he was called into an Annisquam classroom to help the teacher with his class, all of whom were very excited by this new sentiment. Bradstreet was delighted to find that youth, who had been resistant to his previous attempts to enroll them in Sabbath day classes, were now eager attendees. He explained,
"The young folk who used to be always quarreling, swearing, and drinking are wonderfully reformed. As for their elders, I assure you there have been no divisions in the congregation and no outrageous behavior, no dreams, no visions, trances, or extorters."
A challenge for the Squamers came when Reverend Bradstreet died in 1762. The loss of a much-loved long-term minister left a great vacuum. Instead of immediately calling a new minister, the congregation hired visiting preachers to fill the pulpit until 1766, when they called the Reverend John Wyeth, another young man fresh out of Harvard. The church had not been unanimous in their appointment of him, and that is always a bad sign. Even nowadays, denominations warn churches not to appoint a minister who does not receive the vote of at least 90% of church membership. This was borne out in Annisquam when parishioners, offended by Wyeth's manner, complained.
"There is nothing against his moral character, but in the pulpit and in the parish he is wanting in the sanctified dignity which we feel to be indispensable in the deportment of a minister."
He has a very combative manner.
These parishioners were known to their fellows as the aggrieved brethren, and they petitioned for Wyeth's dismissal, but were voted down. The aggrieved responded first by playing tricks on Mr. Wyeth, some with an element of humor, as when they painted his black horse white so that he couldn't find it when he had to go out on a call. some extremely hostile, culminating in someone shooting a musket ball through the window of his house. We think we live in violent times, but apparently our ancestors were also very volatile. The parish council sought help from the town constables, who condemned the aggrieved actions but exacted no punishment. The parish council then asked the town
that you unite with us in seeking help from the governor and council in suppressing the open villainy that has from time to time been committed in the parish against our minister and our parish member, Adoniram Griffin. We ask that you send out of town persons who have been threatening them.
There was no response from the officials. Reverend Wyeth decided to go back to Cambridge, expressing his anger by vowing,
"You have not heard the last from me. I am suing the parish for the wages due to me. You shall pay."
And they did. A committee settling with him successfully and calling in the state council to force the aggrieved brethren to pay their parish rates to offset the cost of the wages. Mr. Wyeth left the ministry and became a lawyer, a profession to which he was probably better suited. After another 3 years of visiting ministers, the parish sent out a proclamation to the village.
We hereby set aside a day of humiliation, fasting, and prayer for the forgiveness of our sins on July 2nd, and to seek direction of God preparatory to the choice of a minister or pastor.
At first, their prayers seemed answered. The new minister, the Reverend Obadiah Parsons, called in 1772, was voted in unanimously. For 7 years, all was well. The services over which Reverend Parsons presided were very different from the ones we attend today. Parishioners not only shared stories of their spiritual conversions, they also were required to confess their sins and retail the worst ones, asking for public forgiveness. Unlawful sexual acts were among those sins. Here is an example from a church service on January 10th, 1773.
The widow Martha Robinson is called to confession.
I, a member in full communion with this church, confess to my public breach of the seventh commandment by the sin of fornication. I stand here ready to make satisfaction for my sins in the hope of being restored to the communion and fellowship of the church.
Martha was restored to that communion, but in 1779, when charges of bastardy were brought against the Reverend Obadiah Parsons himself by a parishioner, Anna Thomas, the charges were not so easily resolved. Reverend Parsons told the First Council of Deacons that met in his home that he was innocent, but he refused to come to a full parish meeting if Anna Thomas was to be present, stating instead he would reply to the charges in writing. In that meeting, the elders heard testimony from a black woman servant, or more probably slave, living in Reverend Parsons' home, who reported on the meetings between Thomas and the Reverend the previous summer. However, her evidence against him was dismissed by the elders on the grounds,
"We do not believe that truth can come from a dark skin."
The elders then voted that they found the charges against the Reverend unsupported, but faced with the fact that half of the congregation had left the church, they stated it to be prudent that the pastoral relationship be dissolved. A parish meeting was called to accept this judgment. Apparently, the parish members were able to believe that truth could come from a dark skin, because they were infuriated by the council's decision upholding Reverend Parsons' innocence. In the parish meeting that was held to confirm the council's decision, the parish rebelled and voted,
"We do not accept the aforesaid result of a dissolution of our pastoral relationship. Be it remembered, we now vote to dismiss Mr. Parsons unanimously.
They wanted to be clear that this was not a peaceful parting, but a dismissal of a minister who was not living in the way of the gospel. The damage done to the congregation was great, as witnessed by the gap of 25 years before they called a new minister, keeping the church open through the use of visiting preachers. It was not entirely the spiritual trauma of a minister's betrayal which made this hiatus so long. The years of the American Revolution and later the events leading up to the War of 1812 resulted in much distress and poverty. In 1775, when the church building was severely damaged by a lightning strike, all they could afford to do was patch it up and struggle on in a less than adequate structure for 50 years. A permanent minister's salary and housing were impossible. But it was to this compromised church that in 1804 another young minister, this time from Brown University, arrived in Annisquam. The Reverend Ezra Leonard was born in the same year, 1775, as lightning struck the church. Leonard struck with a different lightning, that of love, which healed the congregation and the wider parish community of their wounds. Over the years, he became known as Father Leonard, and a father he was to his congregants and to the people of Annisquam Parish. He took biblical generosity quite literally, one day giving away his wife's new shoes to a barefoot woman, and on another giving away their fire bellows to a widow whose wood was green. That his wife, a native of Annisquam, remained devoted is a sign that she was as generous as her husband. They both truly lived the gospel, and not just with their church members, but with the entire parish village. Concerned about the lack of a doctor in Annisquam, Father Leonard studied medicine so that he could care for the physical as well as the spiritual health of his congregation. The most revolutionary change he brought, however, was to their spiritual health by his conversion to Universalism, to which the congregation responded in 1811 by also converting rather than lose their beloved minister. The few that did not believe in this new doctrine of universal salvation left to form the Orthodox Congregational Church in Lanesville. Universalism had started in America in Gloucester around 1779 and was well established at the Independent Christian Church there by the time of Father Leonard's call to Annisquam. Some reports are that it was the Gloucester Universalist ministers, Reverend John Murray and Reverend Thomas Jones, who converted him. But church historian Charlotte Lane reported in her 1892 address to the church that it was an elderly woman parishioner with whom he often discussed theology who converted him.
I told him I was convinced of the truth of universalism, having read the Universalist literature and compared it to the Bible, in which I found a loving God and hope of salvation for all. He was still not convinced, so I said to him, Father, here, read Hosea Ballou's treatise on atonement. It will answer all your questions. And that finished him. He converted.
Father Leonard's conversion was a cause of consternation among the Orthodox ministers on Cape Ann. Particularly antagonistic was the Sandy Bay congregational minister, Reverend David Jewett, with whom he previously had had a collegial relationship. Reverend Jewett was not silent about his contempt for Father Leonard's new theology, writing and publishing many letters against him. Finally, Leonard replied in a 15-page letter that included this explanation of his new theology.
From what source has arisen all these persecutions and barbarities, which have been committed by professors of religion, except a belief in God's partiality for them? Millions of men have been cruelly tortured and put to death by those who have embraced such doctrines. May God free our minds from prejudice, superstition, and cruel bigotry, and fill our souls with divine love.
2 years before his death, the parish decided to build a new building, our present church of Greco-Gothic design. The architect was Annisquam resident James Dennison. On August 8, 1830, Father Leonard preached a sermon based on the book of Acts to inspire the construction.
Heaven is my throne, and earth is my footstool. What house will ye build me, saith the Lord? On what is the place of my rest?
The next day, the congregation started razing the old meeting house and building a new one. The dedication of the new church took place in the winter, and among the participants was the Reverend Hosea Ballou, also called Father by his Boston congregation and credited by many Universalists as being the father of Universalism in America. Also present was the first president of Tufts College, which was founded by the Universalists, Lucius Page, as well as the Gloucester minister, the Reverend Thomas Jones, and other prominent Universalists. I mention this because I've often heard people say that Annisquam Church was not very committed to Universalism. Yet as I have read the history, I have found that until the dissolution of the denominational tie in 1953, the parish was indeed very committed. For 140 years, the ministers were Universalists. At the height of Universalism in 1854, it was one of the largest Universalist societies in New England with 200 families. Throughout its history, the church sent delegates to the Universalist General Convention. Ministers and later their wives wrote for the denominational publications. There is throughout a sense that this congregation was strong in its Universalist faith. The Universalists were, from the beginning, a church in which the women were active. Their voices were raised and heard, and this was reflected early in the participation of women in the Annisquam Church and in village life. If women saw a problem, they did something to solve it. The Ladies' Benevolent Society was founded in 1839 here for charitable endeavors. According to Mrs. Woodbury in an article for the Gloucester Times in 1937, the impetus for the founding of the Benevolent Society was a financial depression caused by the failure of the United States banks during Andrew Jackson's administration. Annisquam had been enjoying a brief time of prosperity before the crisis, but the panic of 1839, Woodbury explained, was so severe that the village did not recover and business continued to dwindle. The women set about finding ways to help. One of the first acts of the Ladies' Benevolent Society in 1840 was to give a pair of elegant pulpit lights to the church. The Ladies' Sewing Circle also contributed to church and town, loaning money as well as giving. The village also formed groups to raise funds for town endeavors, including the private subscription campaign which paid for the bridge, built in 1846. Both town and church held entertainments, fairs, and concerts, usually at the church. So many were held that in 1843, the church added a new bylaw requiring that consent of the parish committee was required before any event could be scheduled. The turnover of ministers was rapid in the 19th and 20th century, probably due to the lower salaries Annisquam could afford, leading it to become a starter church for new ministers or a retirement church for older ministers. Most of the clergy left with kind words for the congregation and their time there, but not all were pleased. The Reverend B.H. Clark wrote in 1848,
"My connection with the parish terminated. The cause of the dissolution is not yet clearly ascertained, but it is generally alleged to be heresy, but whether on my part or on the part of the parish remains unsettled."
His immediate successors, the Reverend Bartlett, the Reverend Coffin, and the Reverend Nathaniel Gunnison, stayed briefly but parted with good words. During Reverend Gunnison's 3 years, the building was renovated and pews were filled every Sunday. The Civil War ended this pleasant time. Charlotte Lane recalled the beginning of the war in Annisquam in her 1892 speech to the congregation.
Many present can remember the sadness of that April Sabbath when the band played through the streets mingling its music with that of the church bell, calling the boys in blue to duty.
As with the previous wars, a toll was exacted on the community, not only in death and injury, but in finances. In 1862, the church had to take out a loan to settle the demands of the minister, Reverend Record, for funds owed him. The parish voted to raise $750 to pay him and to pay back a note held by the Ladies' Sewing Circle against the parish. The minister that followed in 1862 to 65, the Reverend James Tuller, is remembered only for being so disgusted with his wife's cooking that he threw a pot of her beans into the harbor. Not exactly a minister living the life of the gospel. His successor, the Reverend John Willis, called his ministry short, anxious, and wearing. He was faced with his parishioners suffering from the grievous losses of war. Paul Kenyon, in his church history, found among Willis's papers this death notice.
February 27th, 1866. Mrs. Sally Griffin, widow, died of a broken heart for her son who was starved to death by rebels in Belle Isle prison. She was 78.
With the nation once more at peace, it would seem that Annisquam's third parish would also have peace. However, the next minister, the Reverend Frederick Benton, although beloved by most of the congregation, plunged them into turmoil due to his own crisis of faith. After a successful first year in 1869, the Reverend Benton wrote that he could not accept a second term because
my sermons have revealed a considerable disparity of belief between the parish, in the instance of some of its numbers at least, and myself.
The parish council had been unaware of any disparities of belief and had planned to hold a meeting after the Sunday service to vote the Reverend Benton in for a second year. They postponed that meeting for a week and asked that a copy of the Winchester Declaration of Faith, adopted by the General Convention of Universalists at Winchester, New Hampshire in 1804, be made available to parishioners to help them determine just how the Reverend Benton was straying from Universalist beliefs. Adding to the confusion is Reverend Benton's long, loving, eloquent letter to them, in which he never quite states what the difference of belief is. He expressed concern that the Universalist denomination might refuse to ordain him and asked if the church would find some other path to his ordination, but he fails to state why the denomination might refuse. The only hint we have is that Article 2 of the Winchester Confession can be taken as a belief in the Trinity. It states a belief in one God, whose nature is love, revealed in our Lord Jesus Christ by one Holy Spirit, grace, who will finally restore the whole family of mankind to holiness and happiness. However, even if the Reverend Benton could not agree with the Trinity as thus defined, the Winchester Confession provided him and any other doubters with a final declaration called the Liberty Clause, which states, neither this nor any other form of words shall be imposed as a creedal test. In other words, Universalists could not demand that everyone in the congregation, not even the minister, adhere to this confession of faith. The only test they had to pass was to do good works. Reverend Benton did not express a wish to convert his congregation to his views. Instead, he writes,
I cannot expect the congregation to surrender their views and endorse those tenets of mine which they have taken exception to. All I desire is a belief in the morality I strive to inculcate and the love of God which I recommend. They need not sanction my head, but I do ask them to agree wholly with my heart.
And they did. The congregation voted to extend his contract for the next year and held their own ordination ceremony for him in November, ordaining him as neither a Universalist nor a Unitarian, but as an independent Christian minister. Unfortunately, the Reverend Benton, who had already been in poor health, went into serious decline in the course of that year, unable to preach for the last 6 months of his ministry, in which the congregation paid him in full. So the congregation weathered another crisis of faith without having to choose between being Universalist and Unitarian. But in 1870, while searching for a minister, the parish enacted some important and revolutionary changes, which reverberated in church and village. Foremost of these was the extension of suffrage to women. They made women full voting members of the church and also extended voting rights to those members of the church who resided outside the parish limits. Women had already had improved status under Reverend Benton because in 1869 the parish committee had voted that the committee should be composed of 4 men and 3 women. One of the first women on that committee was Clara Davis, who then married Reverend Benton, something that you couldn't do nowadays. And they did have one son, Herbert Benton. I say this because if you go to the exhibit, you'll see a signature quilt with Clara Benton's name on it and the Reverend H.E. Benton, and that was her son, who was a Universalist minister. Apparently he had no doubts about his faith. She died in 1912, which makes that quilt pre-1912. So all of these changes were a movement towards a more liberal, inclusive, and sociable approach to church and village life. Annisquam was changing after the Civil War, welcoming summer visitors, both as summer rentals and as builders of new summer houses. Among these new part-time residents was a large contingent from Cambridge, including Harvard professors. The cultural life of town and church expanded. Another step to greater openness to newcomers was the proposal that the church purchase the pews, eliminating individual ownership and instituting a rental system. This provided another source of income for the church and a more democratic distribution of the pews, giving everyone a chance to bid each year for the pews. And that must have been quite a thing, because I know that people like to have a particular pew, so I imagine they had a little squabble over that. Another frequent issue in the 19th century was the care of the hearse. For many years, there were 2 sextons at the church, one whose special duties was care and supervision of the hearse, and one whose special duties was care and supervision of the bell. Both these duties reflect in the way the church and the town interacted with each other, because the hearse bore members and non-members to the cemetery, and the bell rang for all events, all funerals, memorials, and more cheerfully for weddings, as it still does today. In 1876, the church was blessed with another Leonard, the Reverend Henry Leonard. He had served congregations in Maine and Philadelphia and was a much honored chaplain in the Civil War. He had lived in Rockport and was now nearing retirement, so he enjoyed coming to Annisquam, where he became as beloved as his nameshare of Father Leonard. Henry Leonard was a naturalist and lecturer as well as a minister. Among his most popular talks was one entitled Sermon of the Birds, in which he displayed not only his ornithological knowledge, but also his mastery of bird calls. The Universalist belief was that religion should happify the world, should make people happy. And this the Reverend Leonard did. In the parish records of his death, he is described in these words.
He breathed a sweet and trustful spirit. Always he saw the bright and hopeful side of life.
One of the things that happens over the years with the Universalists in church is that when someone died, they would write a little description of him or her, praising them in the notes, and often usually saying they've gone on to another life, because the Universalists very much believe they did. The congregation survived on supply ministers for 6 years and summer ministers for 3. Then in 1889, a young minister was called the Reverend George Penniman, who galvanized the congregation. His first changes were conservative, but pointed toward creating more open procedures. He prepared and printed a small pamphlet defining the church's organization and beliefs for members and non-members. He requested that ushers organize so there'd be 2 present, 1 for each church door at all services and events, and requested a music committee be appointed, and when it was, all the committee were women. He established a rota for communion to be held on the first Sundays of January, July, October, and on Easter. Next, he moved into high gear, proposing a renovation of the church building. Here he had amazing success. The parishioners leaped willingly to the challenge. Out went the box pews to be replaced by row pews. A chandelier and new carpet was installed. The ceiling and walls were repaired and frescoed. A new, wider pulpit was built, and the organ was brought down from the balcony to the main floor. They kept moving the organ every few years, actually. A festive rededication service was held in 1892, at which Reverend Dr. Richard Eddy, representing the Universalist denomination, remarked,
"I congratulate this parish heartily on what my eyes have seen and my ears have heard. Your determination not to incur a debt is unparalleled in the history of church renovation."
The success of the renovation was only the first step in the Reverend Penniman's vision. He now pressed for a vestry, that's a room for the minister and the choir to robe in, a parsonage, a rewriting of the church constitution and bylaws to incorporate them, and more participation from the adults in the youth ministry. His new suggestions were not so enthusiastically received. Part of the reaction was economic concern, for once again hard times had come upon the nation. Annisquam businesses were suffering, but Reverend Penniman was unconvinced that a vestry and parsonage were not possible goals.
"I appreciate the business depression and the hard times under which we have been and are still laboring. But considering the efficient aid which our friends, and especially our summer visitors, are always glad to render us when they see us trying to help themselves, I believe that with the first indication of a renewal of business in our community, we should make a vigorous attempt to meet one or both of these needs."
This is one of the first times in the parish records that includes a reference to the increased participation of the summer members of the Annisquam community in the life and sustenance of the church. The church also helped the summer residents, most particularly in 1893, when Harvard professor John Wright asked to use the church for a public lecture by Swami Vivekananda, an exponent of Vedanta, a philosophical form of Hinduism. Swami Vivekananda had traveled to Chicago to speak at the World Parliament of Religions, but had been denied access due to his lack of credentials. His speech at the church and enthusiastic references from Annisquam permanent and summer residents, including Professor Wright, resulted in his being admitted to the World Parliament, where his speeches were a great success. The increasing openness of Universalism as a denomination to communicating with other world religions, as well as the village church's goodwill to the summer residents, meant that Reverend Penniman and his congregation welcomed the professor and the Swami. This event has subsequently made the church a place of pilgrimage for followers of Vedanta Hinduism. Lack of congregational initiative on other issues, however, caused the Reverend Penniman to resign at the close of the Sunday service on October 8, 1893. These people were quite dramatic about their resignations. He was at the time not only minister in Annisquam, but also at the Lanesville Universalist Church. So this was a double resignation. However, his resignation was not accepted until the next year in October, when the church again entered into a series of pleasant but short ministries. The congregation had, however, gotten the message about the importance of the summer residents, and in 1903, a resolution was passed in the meeting by Helen Lane.
For those who spend the summer months in this community and are interested in the welfare of the church, he extended a cordial invitation to become members of the Annisquam parish of Gloucester.
The resolution passed, but without a definition as to what such membership entailed. The inference is that no pressure was exerted upon these new members of the parish to become Universalists. This new form of membership honored the generosity of the out-of-towners who had contributed to the 1892 renovation and were continuing to provide the church with funds for improvement. In 1903 especially, one of those summer residents, Mrs. Simpson of Newton, gifted the church with electric lighting. The Reverend Hiram Smith arrived in 1905 and stayed until 1909, and in this short time, the congregation managed finally to restore the belfry to its former glory and fix the ceiling. The church was also getting more organized in structure, which showed in its more detailed budget accounts, where in 1906, for the first time, the proceeds from the church fair were listed. This fair, which in the late 1940s became the Sea Fair, is advertised now as being in its 172nd year. I have not found any records of it until 1906. That doesn't mean it wasn't going along a lot earlier, because there were a lot of things that aren't in the records. I'd love to find out how they established that date. In 1906 also, the church was experiencing some trouble with vandalism, particularly on the 4th of July. The town celebration was reported as very rowdy, so much so that in 1908, the church paid a constable $15 to protect the building on the 4th. And in 1909, the police arrested vandals breaking into the church on July 3rd. The matter was handled discreetly, and no mention was made of trouble in the following years. The sexton complained in 1906 of the Greek peddlers who used the church's front lawn as a feeding ground for their horses. No steps, however, were taken to stop the peddlers, who were probably a welcome visitation each year to the housewives of the town, but not to the sexton. Reverend Judson Marvin came in 1909 and served until 1919. According to church historian Paul Kenyon, Reverend Marvin was well liked for his good preaching, sense of humor, and enthusiasm for the Annisquam baseball team. I don't know if we still have one. That he also was here during the First World War meant that he must have been a good pastor to those who were suffering from losses during that time. He was succeeded by the Reverend George Lewis, whose ministry was also a time of pleasant relations in both church and town, but there was an underlying unease expressed in the increased efforts by the church to involve the community in church services and fundraising. One of Reverend Lewis's innovations was the organization of Rally Day in September 1920. He appointed a committee to invite and to urge every person in the village to attend church on Rally Day, October 3rd. I don't know that he actually got them to attend, but they tried. Fundraising events, which would include the village, also increased, such as the summer fair, a Valentine party, concert, pie socials, whist parties, and the Leonard Club's parties. Two major historical anniversaries also took place: the 300th anniversary of the Massachusetts Bay Colony and of Gloucester, and the 200th anniversary of the church in 1928, at both of which Reverend Lewis spoke, which gave the church a wider public presence. This outreach to the community was needed because attendance at church was decreasing. In December 1928, the church purchased a new parsonage at 129 Leonard Street, to which in March 1929 they welcomed their new minister, the Reverend Benjamin Hershey, a graduate of Tufts Universalist Divinity School. In his charge to the minister at Hershey's installation, the Reverend Ulysses Milbourne urged the minister and the congregation to be inclusive, not exclusive. The parish took a step in that direction the next year by abolishing pew rentals. This change was both theologically and financially good. Theologically, it meant that church services were open to all without segregating non-members in the special visitors' pews. Financially, it must have seemed a risk in 1929. However, by switching to asking people to pledge money to the church, income increased from $158 in pew rentals to $1,500 from pledges in 1930. In 1939, the church incorporated as third or Annisquam parish in Gloucester under Massachusetts law, which required that bylaws had to be instituted again and a parish seal created bearing the image of the church belfry, which we still use today. Membership was defined as open to anyone over 21 who contributed regularly, expressed interest in the congregation's welfare, and a desire to take part in its affairs. No religious statement of belief was mentioned. The definition of membership would allow for people to join without being Universalists, but did not mean the church itself was not Universalist. The Depression hit hard in 1933. The parish was forced to borrow 20% from the principal of their trust funds to pay bills and to pay off the parsonage mortgage, because, as was recorded in the notes, the people just don't have the money. Despite their own hardships, though, in 1934, the church sent provisions and a check for $13.50 to the Home for Little Wanderers, and $13.50 was decent money then. The Reverend Hershey was active in the community, serving on the governing board of the Village Hall Association as a secretary of the Leonard Club. He was also very engaged with his parishioners, making 510 parish calls in 1933. His wife was also busy in church affairs, as well as having 2 children born in Gloucester. The Hersheys left in 1935 to go to a bigger church in Portland, Maine. Years later, he became president of the theological school at Tufts. The next 2 ministries were brief. Both pastors soon moved to congregations in Maine, which paid considerably more than Annisquam. Money was an issue, since in 1937 the church had again taken money from the trust fund for repairs and renovations of the church, including purchasing a new organ. In 1939, the Reverend Morris Robinson became the minister. By 1944, the church was faced again with a minister having a crisis of faith. Since the turn of the 20th century, the Episcopal presence had been growing among the summer residents. Many had happily attended the Universalist services for years, as Mary Wallace, who spent her childhood in Annisquam, recalls in her memoir, Summer Magic.
In the wintertime, we were Episcopalians, and in the summer, we were Universalists. The village church in Annisquam was the one that Mother had attended as a child. There were no stained glass windows, no candles, no crucifix. But there was beauty in the polished wood of the pews, the white walls, the voices of the choir. And as we watched the white clouds in the sky outside the open windows and saw the green arms of the trees reaching heavenward, we came to know that peace of God, which passeth all understanding.
By the 1940s, for some Episcopalians, that peace was not enough. They were growing tired of the Universalist services and were holding alternate Episcopal worship, led by the Episcopal Reverend Dr. Osgood and Reverend Robinson. In 1943, Reverend Robinson, citing this involvement, asked the parish committee to study the covenant of 1793, made when the church was still Puritan, because, he said, some people felt it was unclear whether they were joining the church or the parish, and if not a member of the church, could they receive communion? This seems like a strange confusion coming from a Universalist minister, since communion in Universalism was open to everyone. He then said that in the 1928 incorporation of the parish, it was listed as being a non-denominational, independent religious corporation. This must have come as a shock to the congregation, who had for all these years still considered themselves Universalists. The 1928 papers, in fact, did establish the parish as a corporation, but the words non-denominational and independent were not used. In late 1944, Reverend Robinson announced he was becoming an Episcopalian and resigned, and the congregation voted not to accept his resignation and made an application to Episcopal Bishop Sherrill to allow Reverend Robinson to remain with the intention of the church becoming Episcopal, starting with the teaching of Episcopal doctrine to the Sunday school. This attempt at conversion of the congregation failed swiftly. By December of 1945, the Reverend Robinson resigned again, and this time his resignation was accepted. Meanwhile, the parish was once again able to release some of their angst in a renovation campaign when in 1946 the summer residents, Mr. and Mrs. Quincy Bent, donated $15,000 for a new parish house. Money for operation of the church, however, was still tight, and became more so when the Universalist Association informed the Ministerial Search Committee that the salary Annisquam was offering was too low and that no minister under 70 would be able to accept it. The association did offer to grant the church some funds to raise the salary to an adequate level. In 1947, the Universalists in the congregation reacted to the Episcopal conversion attempt by changing the language in the church's certificate of incorporation to read, although the historic name is Third Annisquam Parish of Gloucester, it has for many years been known as the Universalist Church in Annisquam. Its purpose is establishing and maintaining the public worship of God in accordance with the principles and doctrines of the Universalist doctrine. In 1946, the new minister, Reverend Keith Munson, a recent graduate of the Universalist Divinity School at Tufts, and his wife Peggy, injected new vitality into the congregation. Sunday school enrollment doubled, square dancing and pageants enlivened church and village, and most important, Reverend Munson expanded the church fair into the sea fair, involving all Annisquam residents. His ministry was not without problems, but during his tenure, Reverend Munson spoke of these problems only obliquely. Later, however, he disclosed to Paul Kenyon that there had been at least one individual who attacked him with such viciousness that he decided to seek a call to another church. That he was targeted for the ideas expressed in his sermons seems clear in this response he gave in his minister's report of 1947.
I preach to and from a free pulpit. You asked me to come and preach my convictions, to be sincere, and to speak the truth as I saw it from this pulpit. You gave me this honor and trust as you have done to all ministers since Reverend Ezra Leonard. In correlation, you have reserved the free pew, which involves the privilege of accepting or rejecting that which is preached. And in so doing, not undermining the preacher or refusing to cooperate because of differences of opinion with him. This is a pledge you have made to your minister, and he asks you to take.
Some of these complaints may have been about his Universalist beliefs, for he stated in his minister's report that although he proclaimed himself a Universalist, he felt that Annisquam needed a community church, not a denominational one, because the lines of disagreement, especially on theological matters, must be cut away. He then warned this takes a big people. Apparently, he feared a real showdown between the different theological factions in the congregation, for he accepted a call to Palmer Mass in 1948. The next minister was a Methodist, Reverend Russell Johnson, who left after 15 months to work with the American Friends Service in Cambridge. But he was followed by a Universalist, the Reverend George Abbey, whose ministry lasted only a year. In November 1950, the parish committee demanded Abbey's resignation, citing that he had not been pastoral enough, that he had not been ordained by the Universalists as he had promised, but by a non-denominational church in Detroit, and that he had enrolled as a special student, not as a degree candidate at Boston University School of Theology. He was instructed to resign, given $300, and told to vacate the parsonage in 30 days. Later, Reverend Abbey explained,
The real issue is that I signed an appeal for funds for the defense of Professor Struick, a mathematician at MIT accused of intent to overthrow the government. The Church Fathers of Annisquam are more concerned about respectability and maintaining property values than in upholding the liberal traditions of universalism.
It was the scary times of McCarthy's America, and Reverend Abbey was a victim of his own good intentions and the parish committee's fears. His ministry struck a heavy blow against universalism in Annisquam. That blow became fatal with the next minister, Reverend Robert Cobb. Paul Kenyon states in his history that Cobb, who served a year, 1952 to 1953, left to seek for professional advancement. Reverend Munson, in a letter to Reverend Fayette Severinsen in 1997, remembered it differently.
Cobb published a book about Annisquam as a segregated community, and he was soon terminated. It was about this time that the good folks of the parish began to look elsewhere for ministerial leadership.
If Munson is correct, that would set the time for the dissolution of the tie with the Universalists as 1953. But if the church was no longer Universalist, what was it? In May 1953, the annual meeting was faced with a vote of whether to close the church. They voted unanimously to keep the church open and commissioned a committee that a report be made by a professor at Gordon Divinity School, Lloyd Perry, to analyze the church organization. In July 1953, Professor Perry recommended a startling theological reorganization in which membership should require a confession of accepting the Lord Jesus Christ as your personal Savior, followed by baptism and the inclusion of the Apostles' Creed in every service. The church asked the parish committee to present another reorganization plan of their own in November, but instead of that, the parish committee presented a candidate for ministry, the Reverend Floyd Hamilton, a conservative Presbyterian who arrived in December. Reverend Hamilton, although a very good man, was a fundamentalist, almost a Calvinist in theology. In his newsletter Meditations, he castigated his Annisquam congregation as sinners for not keeping the Sabbath and threatened them with hellfire. He refused communion to the Unitarians and Universalists in the congregation, requiring that a confession of Jesus as Lord and Savior be a requirement for membership. One person wrote in great distress, saying that when the church left Universalism, it had assured those Unitarians and Universalists in the congregation that they would retain full membership, impossible if such a confession was required. Although some people approved of Reverend Hamilton's strict precepts, many more were upset and advocated for a more liberal approach. By December 1954, a vote was taken which defined the church as a Protestant interdenominational church for the public worship of God. The tide was turning against Reverend Hamilton. In April 1955, the 25 voting members present at a special meeting were asked by Paul Kenyon to give an expression of opinion, not a vote, on their approval or disapproval of the minister, which was to serve as a guide to the parish committee on whether to renew or cancel Mr. Hamilton's contract. They also voted on new membership regulations, which did not refer to Jesus as Lord and Savior, but required only a declaration of purpose to join the Christian fellowship of the Annisquam Village Church as an expression of belief in God and the teachings of Jesus, which I have to say is actually a very universalist statement. A few days later, Paul Kenyon had the unpleasant task of telling the Reverend Hamilton it would be wise for him to resign. Kenyon praised Hamilton for his faithfulness to his own beliefs, but explained,
"The Third Annisquam Parish of Gloucester is undoubtedly unusual in its traditions of freedom and in its present insistence on attempting to minister to all within its geographic area, including a wide variety of beliefs and lack of beliefs."
The congregation struggled on, survived, and prospered under the guidance of pastors of several denominations: Methodist, United Church of Christ Canada, Presbyterian, including one ministry of long duration, the Reverend Fayette Severinsen, a Methodist. Together, these ministers and the congregation created a liberal Christian church, unusual in its emphasis on being an interdenominational church, whereas the Reverend Deirdre Greenwood White says each week, you are welcome wherever you are on your spiritual journey. Third Parish is still both a church and a parish, reaching out to all those in the Annisquam community and beyond. The church has retained the best of its Universalist heritage, the insistence on a loving God and the brother and sisterhood of all people. In the words of one of Father Leonard's mentors, the Reverend John Murray, the Annisquam Village Church still offers not hell, but hope and courage, the kindness and everlasting love of God. Thank you.